Welcome to Net Zero. Today, I'm speaking with Joel Armin-Hoiland, founder and CEO of Climate Finance Solution, a company helping climate tech startups secure public funding. Joel, thank you so much for joining. You're calling in from California today, right?
That's right, Northern California.
That's nice. Yeah, so Joel, at CVS, you secured over 1.6 billion USD in grants over the last years. So you're doing an amazing job. For those who haven't heard about CVS before, what exactly do we do and how would you describe your mission in one sentence?
So, Climate Finance Solutions is a global consulting firm that helps climate tech companies and climate related organizations secure large scale, non dilutive public funding. So, that's mostly in the form of grants, but we also do subsidies, tax credits, incentives, and some government secured debt as well. And the large scale piece of that is we're typically looking at opportunities in the millions, but also we do quite a bit of work in the tens and even hundreds of millions as well.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And how did you first get into the climate tech space?
So it kind of started when I was young. As I mentioned, I'm up here in Northern California in Humboldt County. It's a very rural part of the North Coast, and that's where I grew up. And I'm back here now. And the only stuff there is to do here is hiking and biking and backpacking and kayaking and all this outdoor stuff.
Sounds
And
quite
then
nice.
also it's a nice place to be. At the time also, this is where all the big coastal redwoods are. In the time when I was growing up in the 90s, there what we would call the timber wars. Basically, they were trying to cut down the last of the old growth redwoods, and so my family was pretty involved in activism around that. Plus, my dad is a biologist, so as early as the late 80s, early 90s, climate change was a dinner table topic, probably earlier than most people were talking about it. So, this was a focus for me from a pretty young age, and I knew that I needed to do something about it as the defining challenge of our time. So that's what I dedicated my studies and whole career to.
Yes, great. And what were you doing before you founding CVS?
So I've actually been working with climate grants since about 2004, but a pretty wide range of positions and that wide range of things and interdisciplinary approach, I think has really helped us be really successful. I started my studies as my bachelor's of science in environmental science. So kind of getting, that technical underpinning with hard sciences, but it was an interdisciplinary major as well. I've also done work in academic research, which obviously is largely funded by grants. I've worked on the board of directors for about 5 years of the Coastal Fund, which is a grant-making organization. I was the chairman of the board for about a year. It's a rotating chairmanship. So understand how to allocate grants as well, and what goes into managing them on the grantor side. Worked for a short time at a state regulatory agency in California, which obviously has to do with grants. And then in around 2011, got into the world of climate startups, climate tech, SMEs. And also along the way, I should mention I got a master's in environmental law and policy. So kind of having that technical underpinning from my undergrad and some of my other work, the master's really helped me kind of create that systems thinking and strategic view of the entire ecosystem, and then also understand the funding ecosystem from the policy side as well. In the climate tech space, I worked for a small scale bioenergy company that was based in California, but deployed to 40 different countries all around the world. And I had a pretty wide range of roles there over 6 years. So I was on the technical kind of engineering side, and then I was the director of manufacturing, so learned a lot about manufacturing, including outsourcing. I was involved in operations, and then I ultimately was running project development for them, again in 40 different countries, including the US. And then I was running their grant funding. It was largely grant funded for a while, and so got to do work in the US and in Europe and Africa and Asia and South America and all over the place.
Cheers.
And this included winning some grants in Europe, including a life grant, which was kind of a preview to some of the work that we do now. And then I was recruited to work for a company that was doing climate-related sustainable development work in Rwanda. and East Africa. So my wife and I moved to Europe and was mostly living in Europe, but doing work in Africa. And so that really got me even a better sense of the global ecosystem, both in the developing world and in Europe. We were working with a lot of European institutions and a lot of funders. Did that for a couple of years, and then we actually came back. We hadn't seen our families for a while, so we came back to the U.S. for a long holiday at the end of 2019. And of course, we all know what happened at the beginning of 2020. COVID
Yes.
hit, so kind of got stuck here, but that really turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I've always kind of wanted to raise a family here in my hometown, so we bought my childhood home and now raising a family here. We have a 19-month-old daughter, and so it's kind of come full circle in a lot of ways. But kind of fortunate as well. Yeah, when we came back for the holidays, I had left the company in Rwanda and was trying to figure out what my next step was going to be, and was really just started kind of helping friends raise grant funding, because that's what I've been doing pretty much full time for the last several years at that point. I was initially working for friends for free, and then they were referring me to other people who needed help, and that really started blowing up, and realized there was something there, that so many people needed help in this way. So then a few months later, kind of a few months into 2020, kind of really got serious, started doing market analysis, competitive analysis, and realized that there was a real gap in helping climate tech companies access large scale public funding. There are firms, not to say that there aren't other firms that can do this, right? But there aren't that many that can do it at scale, at a really deep technical level, and with a really high success rate, right? And with the kind of specialization that's required for these larger and more advanced projects, right? And so there was an opportunity there, but it was also really important to me to make sure that the most innovative companies were securing this funding, not just the ones that kind of have the relationships and know how to find funding and put projects together, because that is, a lot of the grant funding does go to those companies and not necessarily the most innovative ones.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, thank you. So let's take a larger look on the climate tech landscape, maybe the global look first. So how would you describe the developing of the climate tech space in the last 5 to 10 years? First, maybe on the global um, view.
I mean, it's changed very dramatically, right? From kind of where we were 15 plus years ago with like the clean tech 1.0 bubble that burst. And even just in the last 5 years, it's really transformed, right? Both on the public funding side and the private funding side. So, I mean, we saw investment really, a lot of people know investment in climate and generally surging kind of through 2021, 2022, 5 or 6 times higher than it was a few years before. Peaked in 2021 though, and then really started to decline pretty precipitously in 2023. It was, I mean, obviously that was along with like the broader tech VC market. Climate tech actually slowed a little bit less quickly than other areas. But the slowing also was not uniform, right? The later stage like investment went down faster as well, and so kind of you saw this incredible peak, and then it slowing a little bit, but still didn't go back down to where it was, kind of 5, 10 years ago as well. And then of course, within this environment, public funding was increasing at the same time. Has peaked to some degree in the US and not necessarily in Europe and other places, but with what's happening in the investment market, grants and public funding are even more important. So in that same time period, Europe's ecosystem really matured with the EU Green Deal was really a sea change in Europe. Massive increase in funding made Europe by far the world's largest climate financing geography. Of course, the US with the legislation with the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law in 2022 deployed almost $500 billion in that time period. So dramatically increased the available funding for climate in the US. Of course, the current administration over this past year has reversed almost all, not all of these gains.
How's it going right now in the US? So how are you seeing the impact that the Trump administration has right now? on the
Yeah.
climate tech?
So, well, we're basically constantly scoring own goals ourselves, right? So the administration is basically since January when they came into power, they essentially halted all grants, not just climate grants, but all grants across the entire federal government. They initially completely froze grants, and that was rejected by the courts, but they essentially did a top to bottom review of all grant programs. Many recurring grant programs they canceled. There were many grant programs that people had already applied to or were waiting to hear, and those were also canceled. Even there's been some pretty high profile terminations of existing contracts. Most contracts, including what we would consider climate tech grants, actually haven't been canceled and are still getting reimbursed. But the availability of funding for climate tech has decreased, in a pretty incredible amount. There is still funding available. It's just in a much kind of more narrow set of areas, right? So the administration priorities basically in these areas have to do with geothermal, nuclear, hydro, grid technologies. Critical minerals is a big one. There's like a massive $1 billion opportunity out now, or will be out very shortly for critical minerals, as well as obviously funding for oil and gas and perhaps some different elements that are related to oil and gas. So there is some funding available, and there actually still is like a fairly broad base of funding in terms of the types of technologies, at least more broad based than there was previously. But the federal government is by far the largest funder in general, and certainly climate funder in the US. And so that has gone down. Most of that has gone away, especially from where it was kind of in the heights of 2023, 2024. But state level funding has also increased significantly. California just passed something in a package of bills in September of this year, September 2025, that allocated tens of billions more to climate spending. So there are exciting things happening, but not really keeping up with the gap that the federal government has left.
So I would say it's more important than ever to have you on board and collaborating with you to secure these grants, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly like the stakes of missing an opportunity that you're relevant for is much higher than before, right? A couple of years ago, like, well, we missed that grant, but there'll be another one in 2 months. Now it's like you really need to be able to assess, identify the right opportunities, monitor the ecosystem very closely, and make sure you're applying for the opportunities that you are a fit for, whether that's on the U.S. federal side or U.S. state side, or even in Europe and other places. And then, obviously understanding how to very efficiently and effectively secure that funding is super important. Absolutely.
Yes, I can imagine. To sum the global perspective, to sum it up a little bit, what would you say are the biggest differences between Europe, the USA, and Africa? So you mentioned Africa, so you also got the view there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Europe basically is highly coordinated across the single market, very policy heavy, policy driven. There's kind of like EU funding. There's overarching EU funding that's available in all member states, and then there are national programs as well. With national programs, typically they're easier to apply for, less competitive, usually smaller, and obviously, typically like pretty early or mid stage technologies or development. The EU funding kind of fills in like the very early fundamental gaps, and is most of the kind of larger scale up funding does come from the EU, although the EU certainly funds mid-stage research and pilots as well. There are kind of key mechanisms to know about in Europe, right? With Horizon Europe, the Innovation Fund, which funds like first of a kind commercial deployments. Life EIC Accelerator is quite common. And then, if you're doing it correctly, you can get national funds that kind of complement EU funds. And then you can even use national funds for some EU co-financing requirements. But generally speaking, it's a very kind of strategic and grant heavy model, especially around like consortia, larger scale collaborations, making sure you're aligned with these kind of policy heavy targets. I think the EU also is in the midst of developing kind of additional policy that really has a strategic focus on driving growth and especially economic competitiveness through the use of climate tech, right? They are putting together the Clean Industrial Deal, or that passed in February. They're putting together this 100 billion Clean Industrial Bank. They're streamlining regulations with the Industrial Decarbonization Accelerator Act to enable these larger scale plants to be put in place. There's a whole scale up strategy. So there's a lot going on in Europe to kind of enable this later stage funding and fill these later stage funding gaps. Plus, they're just increasing funding with doubling Horizon Europe and increasing climate there. In the U.S., we talked a little bit about kind of the topical current events that are happening there with the new administration, but generally speaking, U.S. grant funding is more decentralized than in Europe, right? So it's not just the federal government. There's a lot of different state agencies. There's a lot of different agencies within the federal government as well. The U.S. tends to mix competitive grants and tax-based mechanisms. A lot of the Inflation Reduction Act's funding kind of came through this like demand pull or market pull tax-based mechanisms. But, certainly even with the reduction of the federal government, there's a significant amount of funding from state as well, but definitely more kind of like market and incentive oriented than the EU. When you get outside the EU, Canada kind of has fairly similar to the US, or maybe somewhere between the US and EU in terms of the trends and how they fund things. When you get into Africa, that's very driven by international development funding, right? So you're talking about multilateral institutions like the World Bank and Green Climate Fund, bilateral aid agencies and development finance institutions, so mostly international funding, some national funding. Asia is really interesting because it's a much more diverse, right? So there are a lot of different countries with different income levels. So the kind of trend, different countries that are in the similar income level kind of tend to fund things the same. So, Japan, Korea, Singapore have pretty extensive government R&D programs, including for climate, especially in Japan. Obviously, China is much more state directed, and then you get into kind of middle income and low income countries, like India. They have some of their own funding. They also have a lot of multilateral climate funding that comes in. A lot of countries in South or Southeast Asia rely on this multilateral development funding as well, right? So it's very different model from what you're looking at in the US and in Europe.
So if you were a founder, where would you start your company right now? If you had to choose.
Where would I start a climate company?
Yes, climate tech.
I mean, I guess with the caveat that the first principle really needs to be around your market, right? So even though I'm obviously a big believer in public funding, in the power of public funding, if the market, the commercial environment is better in the US, I would say you should start it in the US. But, all things being equal and not kind of specifying any sector or market, I think Europe is probably, the place to be in terms of availability of public funding, both on a national and EU level. Certainly if you're in if you have a business that is going to be scaling up and deploying a larger scale, first of a kind, or, commercial plants that are going to require public subsidies, really, you're only going to get those in Europe, at least right now. Like the high tens, hundreds of millions of grant opportunities that were pretty commonplace in the United States as recently as, 12 months ago, are basically only found in Europe at this point.
Yes, fair enough. So you mentioned grant funding isn't the only thing for founders and companies out there. So how would you describe the best strategy on combining venture capital and grants alongside the way of a climate tech company?
Yeah. So I think it's a really great question. I think it's really important for founders to have what we call an integrated fundraising strategy. And this is something that we work on with our clients all the time. I think because of the availability of public funding for climate, we know that to really be successful, most climate companies that have achieved growth scale have taken advantage of the full capital stack and all the different types of funding. But it is really important to understand how to effectively integrate these different types of capital, strategic sequencing, how to take them at certain times and in certain amounts to enable each to kind of mitigate the drawbacks of the other ones. So obviously there are drawbacks in every single type of funding, right? Grant funding, as most people who've done grant funding or looked into it know, it's very complex. It's very time consuming. There's a fair amount of post-award management, or maybe a lot of post-award management, depending on the program. There are lag times between the time you apply and the time you receive the funding, but obviously it's non-dilutive, doesn't require you to give up equity, and it provides extremely patient and risk-tolerant capital to give you time to help you de-risk your technology and validate milestones. And it also can actually help you secure equity and other forms of funding on more advantageous terms. So investment funding is highly complementary to this, right? So grants have lag times. Investment funding can help provide the runway that you need to get through those lag times. This is a difficult environment, but it can be faster to raise, and it's definitely more flexible, right? So grant funding and for some of these incentives even, you have to define a very specific project that you're going in, a very specific uses of funds, and you have to do that to some degree with equity, but not nearly to that level of detail. So, it's a lot more flexible. It's great for supporting commercialization, but it is the most expensive form of capital, right? Because you're giving up equity in your company. And of course, debt financing is kind of like the other really big bucket and another really important non-dilutive funding source, and is becoming actually more available from public funding sources than it has previously. I think you want to deploy debt financing in very specific ways. Oftentimes it's for like later stage scale up, infrastructure, revenue generating CapEx, but it can be also used for operating expenses or equipment, depending on what type of business you have. With kind of taking all of those things into account, the strategy has to really be tailored to the needs of your company and part of the overall capital planning process. So you're looking at your technology roadmap, your pathway to commercialization and scale. And ideally, you've done some sort of ecosystem mapping and you're monitoring the funding ecosystem for public funding. And you identified really the relevant funding opportunities that can fund different parts of your technology roadmap. And you kind of match those up to where that funding needs to be used. And then you understand where the gaps are. So that's where you can use equity investment to fill those gaps, or the other way around. I think a lot of companies kind of know, they're in the middle of a raise, or they know how much money they're going to raise. And that you kind of have to analyze where the gaps are going to be there as well, and where you can use grants and non-dilutive funding.
Yes, love these insights. Very interesting. And I think a lot of founders maybe forget about the importance of the grant funding to take it maybe on top of the equity funding. But however, they should reach out to you guys to make sure they know the best way for their equity path and funding path. But yes, let's talk about some examples of companies that you were helping to secure grant funding, and maybe you can share one or two of them.
Yeah, so we work with a very wide range of companies, and we work in climate, but we say we're sector agnostic. So we worked in pretty much every industry vertical, done about 300 projects since I founded the company, a little over 300 at this point since I founded the company in 2020. As you said, as you mentioned, we've raised about 1.6 billion, and we've done that with an over 90% success rate in terms of funding awarded versus funding pursued. So I had a hard time kind of picking different case studies, and obviously can't share the names of all the companies due to confidentiality. But I think one of the things that came to mind was one of our innovation fund projects from last round. So this was a carbon capture that was happening at a chemical production facility with geologic storage of the CO2. The total project size was 350 million euros with 150 million grant. So it was quite a sizable project. Actually, an American company was our client and also the lead applicant, but they had really, really strong European partnerships, including with the company that had the facility, understood, the upstream, the feedstock suppliers, where they sat in the value chain, had a really, strong plan for transportation and storage of the CO2 and all those different elements. So I think for them, especially as an American company, the partnerships are really a key competitive element. Understanding and how they were integrated in the value chain. They also did a really good job of preparation. We did a lot of pre-work and scoping well ahead of time, and they had a lot of documentation that was really helpful for some of the longer lead items that you need for innovation fund, like greenhouse gas methodology and feasibility studies and things like that. So that was a really exciting project. Another project that was not super similar, but like along the same lines, is a company that we can disclose the name. So we worked with a company called Rondo that does thermal. We won a grant that was $75 million from the Department of Energy's Office of Clean Energy Demonstration. That office is now has been disbanded by the new administration, but it was really dedicated to supporting these larger scale, first of a kind commercial demonstrations, just like this one. We worked with one of the largest multinational food and beverage corporations to decarbonize two of their sites. One was a distillery and one was a bottling plant. Used the heat battery that was charged by renewable electricity and could store the heat almost indefinitely, and then output electricity and heat to replace pretty much all the fossil fuels that were used for industrial process heat at those two sites. So really exciting technology. This is something that the EU is very, very interested in. They actually have a whole industrial heat auction, €1 billion industrial heat auction as part of the innovation fund this round. They're also likely to fund thermal heat as through the normal grant process in innovation fund too. I think it would helped that they're an industry leader in terms of the technology and where they are in the market. I think another thing that was really good about this project was it really demonstrated the potential for replication and scaling, not just in food and beverage, but also really across a lot of different industries that need industrial process heat and have grid constraints. And then also the way that they do their process is they do a really good job of being able to kind of rapidly retrofit industrial facilities at commercial scale to really demonstrate how the technology is economically viable without any green premium, right? And I think that a lot of people are talking about that now, like climate technologies cannot have a green premium. They can't be impact first. They have even grant funded ones, at least at scale, really need to achieve cost parity or be cheaper. Obviously, those are two very large projects. We don't always do grants that are in the multi-hundreds or high tens of millions. So I think one exciting Horizon Europe project, there was a European company that we worked with on Horizon for a $7 million grant, or a €7 million grant, sorry. And that was what they do is they convert waste CO2 to chemicals and materials through a fermentation process. They have a really innovative solution that's a really good fit for grant funding. And we went through a very long, very extensive down selection and pre-scoping process with them, and identification process, because they were eligible for a lot of different types of funding opportunities, especially with the latest round of Horizon Europe and Life. So we made sure that we were down selecting and applying for the right opportunity. And then also they just have a really good holistic approach that funders want to see, right? Not just kind of doing R&D or innovation, but really understanding like partnerships and communication and dissemination, all these other things that are really important to be successful with European grants. Of course, things that we helped them with as well.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing these cases. Very interesting. So talking about the European ecosystem, so are you optimistic about the next couple of years, next 10 years for the climate tech space here in Europe with the programs that we have right now?
I do think that there's reason for optimism. I think people in the US have quite a bit of PTSD from going through this last year with the new federal administration. I think we do a lot of work. I mean, actually, the majority of the work that we do is in Europe. And so we're seeing all of the climate funding that's in Europe. And of course, there are policy disagreements about where climate funding is going to go in Europe. But generally speaking, there's still quite a bit of support for funding climate in Europe. And, especially with some of these kind of geopolitical drivers, look with Europe looking at more growth and competitiveness and really, I think, properly assessing that industrial decarbonization can be an engine for economic growth and economic competitiveness, going harder on scale up and infrastructure, I think is actually really positive. And it's really exciting to see, especially because we do a lot of these larger scale projects and we get to be involved in that. And there are tens, if not hundreds of billions more coming down the pike. And obviously a lot of this is being negotiated with the next multi-annual financial framework in Europe. I think in Europe, there's a lot to be optimistic about on the public sector side. Even though they're still negotiating things on the policy side.
Yes.
I think in the US, there's a lot to be positive about on the state level. A lot of states are still increasing the amount of funding. I mentioned California, but there are a lot of other states that have tens of billions. And even some states, red states where you wouldn't consider them like climate friendly or climate funders, and they don't have like climate programs, we've been able to secure funding there through things like, okay, this is not a climate technology, this is advanced manufacturing, or this is critical minerals, or this is economic development. And so reframing things to some degree, which you've always had to do, but being able to do that really enables you to secure funding from those red states, and also from this current administration. We're working on a lot of these critical minerals opportunities right now, and obviously there's a lot of climate benefit there. We're not talking about the climate benefits. We're talking about the onshoring and reshoring and economic competitiveness. So I think it's perhaps not quite as bleak as folks think, but it's definitely not ideal in the US. I think the other thing I would say is that international development funding for climate has always been woefully underfunded, and it still is. Having worked in that space for a very long time, like that is very important to me personally, but also just to the world, right? The majority of the emissions growth from here on out is going to be happening not in Europe and not in the US and not in the industrialized countries. And so if we really want to get a handle on climate, we have to provide more funding in the development space, probably through these multilateral institutions. And then also obviously like we have a duty to provide adaptation funding for these most vulnerable people.
Yes, great insights. At least you made me optimistic about the European side. So let's see how it's turning out in the next years. But yeah, let's speak about different ways for founders they want to get their hands on these grant programs. What are the best ways to reach out to you guys and to CVS?
Yeah, so in terms of just getting in touch with us, you can connect easily through our website, climatefinanceSolutions.com. I think in terms of how to collaborate, I think we provide services really throughout the full funding lifecycle. So everything from funding identification and assessment, funding strategy, funder engagement, proposal development, obviously, is a core part of what we do, and then post-award management as well. So I think that obviously if folks come to us and they have a specific opportunity they're interested in, we obviously are happy to work with them on it. Well, we'll give them our very candid opinion as to whether it's a good fit or not. Oftentimes if folks say, they want grant funding or public funding to be a core part of their capital stack, whether that's for their company or for a project, but they don't have a specific opportunity in mind, that's where the identification and assessment piece comes in. Frankly, I think to me, that's the most important part of the entire process. And sometimes people are surprised to hear me say that. But I mean, look, if you're pursuing the wrong grant or funding opportunity, you're not going to win, right? And so you're wasting your time. Or potentially you could be chasing funding off of your roadmap and you win it and it's a huge distraction for 3 years. And that can be actually worse, right? So I think with every single stage that I was talking about there, it's really important to kind of take a step back, be very intentional, and have a really strategic approach to all of these different elements. So we've actually developed a software platform that enables real-time monitoring and custom matching of grants with alerts when there are relevant opportunities. And I should say grants and incentives and loans and basically just generally public funding related to climate. It's comprehensive for climate-related opportunities in Europe, US, and Canada right now. We are expanding that to new countries over the next few months, and by next year, it should be global. It is an AI, as you can imagine, AI-enabled platform, but I think one of the differentiators for this platform is that there's a human in the loop at every single stage, right? Whether that's the onboarding, the matching, and it also gives you immediate access to our experts for like the pre-scoping that you need to do, the strategy, decision-making support, all directly from our platform. And so that's usually a really great place to start, to just understand strategically like what is out there, and it helps you go through the process of taking a really comprehensive look at the ecosystem, and then helping you go through the right down selection process. So you're only going after the opportunities that you have the highest chance of success with, and are the most well aligned with what you're trying to do. So and it only costs about 80 euros per month as a subscription. And if folks contact us in the next month and mention this podcast, they'll get 3 months for free. So that's a benefit for your listeners.
So yeah, make sure you're gonna use it. Yes, thank you so much. So yeah, you will find all the important links in the video description below, so don't worry. And yeah, Joel, on this point, thank you so much for your time and yeah, the insights. Hope to see you soon and enjoy the California sun.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been really fun talking to you.